A struggling farmer fixes a stranger's broken truck, not knowing a week later his life would change. John Miller stood at the edge of his field, the Kansas wind pulling at the brim of his worn-out hat. The soil beneath his boots was dry and cracked, a cruel reminder of the drought that had battered the land for nearly 2 years. He crouched down, rubbed a clump of dirt between his fingers, and sighed. It crumbled to dust. There was no saving the crops this season. At 48, John felt older than his years. His face, lined and weathered, told the story of a man who had given his life to the land and lost more than he could afford. He was a farmer by blood, born on this very farm, and determined to keep it alive, despite every force working against him. But lately, that determination felt more like stubbornness. The numbers no longer added up. The debts had crept in slowly, like a sickness, and now the bank was circling like vultures above a carcass. His wife, Mary, had passed away 3 years earlier from a sudden illness, and the void she left behind was more than emotional. She had kept the household together, handled the books, and always found a way to make things stretch just a little longer. Now, it was just John and his 2 kids, Lena, 17, sharp and restless, and Caleb, 15, quiet and thoughtful. They had inherited their mother's eyes and their father's resilience. They did what they could to help around the farm, but John could see the worry in their faces. They knew things were bad. That morning, the last of their savings had gone into the fuel tank of the old pickup. John needed parts to fix the irrigation pump, a long shot at salvaging anything before the season ended. As he drove down the long, 2-lane highway toward the hardware store in town, the radio played low, murmuring country tunes between bursts of static. He passed miles of golden-brown fields, all suffering the same fate as his own. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and something faintly acrid, like burnt oil. As he rounded a bend, he spotted it. A late-model pickup truck pulled over on the side of the road, steam billowing from the hood. The driver stood beside it, phone to his ear, pacing, clearly frustrated. His clothes were clean, city-style, pressed slacks, a dark wool coat, and he looked as out of place as a suit at a rodeo. John eased off the gas and pulled over without a second thought. Helping folks was second nature out here. As he stepped out of his truck, gravel crunching under his boots, the man turned, lowering his phone. There was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Need a hand?" John asked, wiping his palms on his jeans. The man hesitated, glanced at the engine and nodded. "Yeah, I think it overheated. I've been on hold with roadside assistance forever. I'm supposed to be at a property meeting nearby, but..." John didn't wait for the rest. He popped the hood, letting the cloud of steam escape fully. The engine was hot, no doubt about it. He grabbed an old rag from his truck and started looking things over. "Name's John Miller," he said, reaching in to check the radiator hose. "This road's hell on vehicles when the weather's like this." "Daniel," the man replied. "Daniel Carter. I appreciate you stopping." John gave a small nod, focused on the task. The coolant was almost gone, and the fan belt looked loose. He rummaged through the back of his truck, more a mobile toolbox than a pickup bed, and came back with a jug of water, some duct tape, and a wrench. "What do you do, Mr. Carter?" John asked, not looking up. Daniel paused. "Business, real estate, mostly agricultural development." John let that sink in. The man had money. The clothes, the truck, the way he spoke, it all added up. But why was he out here in the middle of nowhere? In less than 20 minutes, John had the engine patched enough to run safely to town. He closed the hood and wiped his hands clean. "You should be good to go at least until you hit the next service station," John said. Daniel looked genuinely impressed. "Did? Really? Thank you." "That's incredible. You didn't have to stop, but I'm glad you..." He extended a hand, and John shook it. Firm grip, a little too clean. "No trouble," John replied. "Be careful. These roads can be mean when you're not used to them." Daniel got back in his truck, gave a short wave and drove off, leaving a faint trail of dust behind him. John stood for a moment, watching the vehicle shrink into the distance. Then he got back in his own truck, started the engine, and kept driving. He did not expect to ever see that man again. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The Kansas. Morning air carried a biting chill that seeped through the thin fabric of John's worn jacket as he steered his pickup toward town. The sun, barely over the horizon, cast long shadows across the landscape, turning the frost-laced grass silver. The heater in the old truck had been unreliable for months, rattling louder than it warmed, but John barely noticed. His mind was on the list of parts he needed, on the dollars he did not have, and on the growing weight of failure pressing down on him like a physical burden. As he crested a small hill along the two-lane highway, the plume of white smoke caught his eye first, stark against the crisp blue of the sky. There, on the shoulder of the road about half a mile ahead, sat a dark blue pickup truck, angled awkwardly as though it had limped to a halt. Even from the distance, John could tell something was wrong. He slowed instinctively, eyes narrowing, and as he drew closer, the details became clear. The hood was popped open, steam gushed out in thick clouds, and a man stood beside the vehicle, waving a cell phone in the air in frustration. John's boots hit the gravel with a crunch as he pulled over and stepped out. The stranger, a tall man with neatly combed dark hair and a face that seemed too polished for the dusty roadside, looked up sharply, his expression a mix of relief and lingering frustration. He wore black slacks, polished leather shoes, and a heavy wool coat that probably cost more than John's truck was worth. He was completely out of place, like a corporate executive dropped in the middle of the prairie. "Morning," John called out, his voice calm, steady. "Looks like trouble." The man gave a brief, exasperated laugh and lowered the phone. "Yeah, overheating, I think. Radiators smoking like a chimney. Been trying to reach roadside assistance, but no luck." John nodded slowly, stepping closer to the vehicle. His hands were rough, nails permanently stained from years of labor, and they moved with practiced ease as he leaned under the raised hood, peering at the engine. The smell of burnt coolant stung the air. He pressed a palm against the radiator. Hose, careful not to scald himself. "Name's John Miller," he said without looking away from the engine. "Daniel Carter," the man replied, tucking his phone into his coat pocket. "I'm supposed to be at a meeting about 5 miles from here. Could not have picked a worse spot to break down." John gave a short grunt of acknowledgement. The coolant reservoir was bone dry, the radiator cap crusted with residue. The serpentine belt was intact but loose, just enough to cause problems. Without coolant, the engine would cook itself before it got another mile. "Well, Mr. Carter, you are in luck," John said, stepping back and heading toward his own truck. From behind the seat, he pulled out a jug of water and a toolbox that had seen better days, but was still stocked with the essentials. He returned to the broken-down vehicle and started topping off the radiator with slow, steady hands. Daniel hovered nearby, visibly uncertain, as though unsure whether to offer help or stay out of the way. His eyes scanned the empty horizon, the vast openness of rural Kansas clearly foreign to him. "You from around here?" John asked, glancing over. Daniel shook his head. "No, came out from Denver, looking at some investment properties, agricultural mostly. There's supposed to be a land auction out here soon." John kept his expression neutral, though the mention of land auctions struck a familiar nerve. Too many farms had gone under in the past year alone, swallowed up by developers who had no connection to the soil, no respect for the history written into the fields. It was hard not to resent the way money seemed to erase generations of hard work. "You ever fix one of these yourself?" John asked, pointing at the engine. Daniel smiled faintly, shook his head. "Not really my area of expertise." "Figured as much," John replied, not unkindly. He tightened the belt with a wrench, enough to keep things stable until the man could reach a proper mechanic. In the silence that followed, the distant call of a hawk drifted overhead. John finished his work, checked everything twice, then closed the hood with a solid thump. "You should make it into town on this. There's a shop about 10 miles down the road. Tell them John Miller sent you, they'll treat you fair." Daniel extended a hand again, this time with genuine gratitude. "Really, I didn't expect anyone to stop." "I appreciate it, Mr. Miller." John took the handshake, firm but brief. "We were raised. Most folks out here won't leave you stranded." It's how Daniel nodded, eyes thoughtful. For a moment it seemed as though he might say more, but he caught himself, choosing instead to offer a final thank you before climbing into his truck. The engine turned over, hesitant at first, then steady. John stepped back, watched as the pickup eased onto the road and continued its journey, the thin trail of steam now only a faint wisp against the sky. The road was quiet again, save for the soft hum of the wind through the dry grass. John lingered for a moment, staring after the truck until it disappeared beyond the next rise. Then, with the calm of a man used to disappointment, he turned back to his own pickup, climbed inside and headed toward town. The morning was still young, the list of chores still long, and the weight of his troubles unchanged. He did not know that the simple act of stopping that day had just set into motion a series of events that would alter the course of his life forever. The next morning came with the same quiet ache of uncertainty that had become the rhythm of John Miller's life. The sun rose slow and steady over the Kansas plains, casting long fingers of light across the brittle fields outside his window. The rooster's call echoed through the cold air. But John had been awake for hours, lying in bed and counting the cracks in the ceiling as though they held answers he had not yet found. He rolled out of bed, tugged on his work boots, and started the day as he always did, feeding the animals, checking the fence lines, walking the property with the same dogged persistence that had kept him going for years. Caleb and Lena were still asleep when he poured himself a cup of black coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window toward the dusty road that wound past the farm. He did not expect to see the stranger from the day before again. Encounters like that were usually fleeting, no more significant than a wave between passing trucks on the highway. But as he worked through the morning, the image of the well-dressed man beside the broken-down pickup lingered in his thoughts. There had been something in Daniel Carter's eyes, something restrained, like a person holding back more than he was willing to share. By midday, John had pushed the memory aside. The chores demanded his attention, the irrigation pump still needed repair, and there were fence posts to reset before the next windstorm blew them down. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew every inch of his land as well as he knew his own face. It was near sunset when the unexpected happened. John had just finished patching a section of the old chicken coop when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel out by the front gate. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, squinting into the golden light. There, parked neatly along the road, was the same dark blue pickup, and leaning casually against the driver's side door, arms crossed and coat buttoned tight. Against the evening chill stood Daniel Carter. For a moment neither man spoke. John walked slowly toward the fence, resting one hand on the top rail, his gaze steady. "Mr. Carter," he said, "did not expect to see you again." Daniel pushed off from the truck and stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. His expression was relaxed, but there was a tightness at the corners of his mouth that betrayed nerves. "I figured I owed you more than just a thank you," Daniel replied, nodding toward the barn. "If I come in." John studied him for a moment, then unlatched the gate and gestured for him to enter. They walked together toward the porch, the silence between them stretching, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken questions. "I appreciate what you did yesterday," Daniel began, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Most people would not have bothered." John leaned against one of the porch posts, arms crossed. "Other. Like I said, it is how we were raised. Out here, we look out for each." Daniel gave a small nod, but did not seem ready to leave. His eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the expanse of the land, the fading light casting long shadows across the dry earth. "This your place?" he asked. "It is," John answered. "Family land, been in my hands since my father passed." Daniel's gaze shifted back to John, and for a moment his polished demeanor seemed to slip. There was something more, honest in his expression now, something closer to vulnerability. "I grew up not too different from this," Daniel said quietly. "Man worked the land until he could not anymore. Not here, but a place like it." My old John raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. The man before him did not look like anyone who had spent his youth baling hay or mending fences. "Guess you traded the fields for boardrooms," John remarked, the words not unkind, but edged with a bit of the skepticism he felt. Daniel smiled, faintly. "Something like that." The conversation stalled again, the air between them filled only with the soft rustling of the wind through the brittle grass. Finally, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small business card, offering it to John. "If you ever need anything at all, give me a call," he said. John took the card, glanced at it briefly. Simple white embossed lettering, Daniel Carter, Carter Agricultural Development. A corporate logo in the corner, no address, just a phone number. "I appreciate it," John said, tucking the card into the pocket of his jeans. "Charity." But I do not take. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in understanding. "Appreciation. Not charity, Mr. Miller. Just..." With that, Daniel gave a short nod, turned, and headed back to his truck. He climbed in, started the engine and pulled away, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of his offer. John stood on the porch, watching until the truck disappeared down the road. His fingers brushed against the edge of the business card, in his pocket, and though he told himself it meant nothing, he could not quite bring himself to throw it away. That night, as the house settled into quiet and the stars burned bright over the prairie, John sat alone at the kitchen table, the card still resting in front of him. He stared at it for a long time, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. There was something about Daniel Carter, something that did not add up. A man like that out here alone with no assistant, no entourage, no obvious connection to the land he claimed to be interested in. It raised more questions than it answered. But John had enough problems of his own. He pushed the card aside, stood up and turned out the light. It was not the last he would see of Daniel Carter, not by a long shot. The days that followed passed beneath gray skies, the winter wind cutting sharp across the Kansas plains, carrying with it the scent of frozen earth and distant smoke. John Miller moved through the motions of his routine with the quiet endurance of a man who had long since learned not to expect mercy from the world. His hands were always busy, patching the irrigation lines, reinforcing the barn doors, checking on the small herd of cattle that remained. The work helped keep the darker thoughts at bay, but it could not drown them out completely. There had been no sign of Daniel Carter since that brief encounter at the gate. The business card remained tucked into the top drawer of John's desk, almost forgotten beneath a stack of unpaid bills and notices from suppliers. The words Carter Agricultural Development stared up at him each time he rifled through the drawer, but he never reached for the phone. Pride, stubborn as the land itself, held him back. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, its envelope stamped with the unmistakable logo of First National Bank of Wichita. John recognized it immediately, the same emblem that marked the monthly statements he dreaded opening. He stood at the mailbox for a long moment, the paper cold in his hands, before finally tearing it open with the edge of his thumb. The words on the page were blunt, clinical, devoid of compassion. Notification of foreclosure proceedings, the final notice. Unless the outstanding balance was paid in full within 3 weeks, the property would be seized, auctioned to the highest bidder. No room for negotiation, no appeal. John read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and slid it back into the envelope. His jaw clenched, muscles tight beneath the stubble of his unshaven face. The weight of the news settled on his chest like a stone. He stood there at the edge of the dirt road, the wind snapping at the corners of the paper, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the crack in his resolve widen. When he returned to the house, Lena was setting the table for dinner, the aroma of roasted potatoes and onions filling the small kitchen. Caleb sat by the stove, sketching in a notebook, his pencil scratching softly against the paper. They both looked up as John entered, reading the tension in his shoulders, the hollowness in his eyes. "What is it, Dad?" Lena asked, her voice too steady for someone so young. John forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Nothing for you two to worry about." But Lena's gaze was sharp, inherited from her mother, and she was not fooled. Caleb watched silently, sensing the shift in the air, though he said nothing. They ate in near silence that evening, the clink of forks against plates the only sound between them. When the meal was over and the dishes washed, John retreated to the porch, sinking into the creaking wooden chair that Mary had bought from a neighbor years ago. The stars blinked above the dark silhouette of the fields, cold and distant. He thought about the numbers, ran them over and over in his mind. Even if he sold the last of the livestock, even if he let go of the aging equipment. At a loss, there would not be enough to cover what was owed. The drought had stripped the land bare and stripped John's options along with it. There was no help coming. Not from the bank, not from the neighbors who were struggling just as much, and he was not the kind of man to ask for handouts. The next morning, John drove into town, the foreclosure notice folded neatly in the glove compartment. At the bank, he asked to see the branch manager, a woman named Susan Taylor who had known him for over a decade. She offered him a sympathetic smile, but little else. "John, I wish there was more I could do," Susan said gently, sliding the papers across the desk between them. "But this decision came down from corporate. They are not extending grace periods right now, not to anyone." "I am not asking for charity," John replied, his voice low, steady. "Just a little time." Susan shook her head slowly, her expression pained. "Was anything? I know. But their hands are tied." "If there is not," John finished for her. He stood, folding the papers, and tipped his hat politely. "Thank you for your time." He left the bank without looking back, the weight of inevitability pressing harder with each step. Back at the truck, he sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield at the familiar streets of the small town he had called home his entire life. Every storefront, every cracked sidewalk, every faded sign held a memory. The thought of losing the farm, the place where his children had taken their first steps, where he had built a life with Mary, was more than he could bear. That evening, after putting the livestock away and checking the fences once more, John found himself standing alone in the barn, the soft creak of the rafters overhead breaking the silence. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. His mind raced through the possibilities again, but the result was always the same. There was no way out. In the quiet of the barn, beneath the dim light of a single bulb swinging overhead, John allowed himself a rare moment of weakness. His hands gripped the edge of the workbench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of failure. But even in that darkness, the memory of Daniel Carter's offer drifted back to him, soft, unbidden, like a whisper carried on the wind. The business card still sat in the desk drawer, untouched. And though John's pride screamed against the idea, the words, "If you ever need anything," echoed louder with each passing hour. He did not reach for the phone that night. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and the thought of that call would not leave him. The bad news had arrived like a storm, tearing through the fragile peace John had managed to hold together. And, though he would not yet admit it, part of him wondered if the stranger on the side of the road had been more than just a chance encounter. Friday morning came wrapped in a heavy fog that rolled across the Kansas fields like a tide, cloaking the land in a hushed stillness. The world beyond John Miller's window was a blur of gray, the outlines of the barn and the skeletal trees, softened by the mist. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, the unpaid bills spread out before him like a jury passing sentence. The foreclosure notice, its sharp legal language unforgiving, sat squarely in the middle of the pile. Lena and Caleb moved quietly through the house, their usual morning chatter subdued. They could feel the tension that clung to their father, like a second skin, though John had said nothing more about the letter. His silence told them enough. The fog had not lifted by the time John stepped out to tend to the animals. The air smelled of damp earth, and the distant sound of a crow's call echoed through the haze. His boots pressed deep into the wet ground as he moved through the motions of feeding the cattle and checking the fences. Each task felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of his troubles had settled into his limbs. When the work was done, he walked back toward the house, head low, thoughts circling the same hopeless path they had been trapped in for days. It was then, passing the mailbox at the end of the long dirt road, that he noticed something unusual. The mailbox, battered and rust-streaked, held only one item, a thick, unmarked manila envelope wedged neatly inside. No return address, no postage stamp, no name written on the outside. Frowning, John pulled the envelope free and turned it over in his hands. The weight of it suggested there was more than paper inside. He looked up instinctively, scanning the empty road in both directions, but the fog revealed nothing beyond a few yards. The envelope had been left deliberately, placed by someone who wanted it found but did not want to be seen. Back inside, John set the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment before finally peeling it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. Scrawled across it in plain, blocky handwriting were just a few words. "Thank you. Use this to start over." Beneath the note was a check. John's breath caught in his throat as he unfolded it, his eyes widening as the number came into focus. $50,000. He held the paper between his fingers, reading the amount again and again as if the numbers might change. But there they were, clear as day. $50,000 drawn from a corporate account. No name, no explanation, just the amount and the same signature he did not recognize. John's mind raced, suspicion and disbelief battling against the faint spark of hope that dared to rise within him. Who would do this? Why? His first thought leapt, unbidden, to Daniel Carter, the stranger on the side of the road, the man who had stood at his gate offering a business card and vague promises of help. Could it be him? John folded the check carefully, tucking it back into the envelope along with the note. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the papers aside and stood, pacing the length of the kitchen. This was not how things were done. Not here. Out here you worked for every dollar you earned. Nothing came without sweat and sacrifice. The idea of accepting such a gift felt wrong, like crossing a line he had drawn for himself long ago. But the alternative, the foreclosure notice still sitting in plain view on the table, reminded him of the reality he faced. The land would be taken. The home where his children had grown up, where he had built a life with Mary, would be gone, and no amount of pride would change that. When Lena and Caleb returned from school that afternoon, they found their father still at the kitchen table, the envelope resting unopened in front of him once more. His coffee sat cold at his elbow, untouched. "Dad?" Lena asked, concern etching her voice. John looked up slowly, eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he considered telling them, but the words caught in his throat. He could not explain what he did not understand himself. "Just thinking," he said softly, offering the same tired smile that had become his shield. The night came down heavy and quiet, the fog thickening as darkness settled over the land. John sat alone by the fireplace after the children had gone to bed, the envelope once again in his hands. He turned the check over, reading the bank information at the bottom. The issuing account was corporate, as impersonal as a machine. On impulse, John stood and pulled on his coat, pocketing the envelope before stepping out into the cold night air. He drove into town, the streets empty save for a few parked cars outside the diner and the faint glow of lights from the gas station. The bank was closed, but he knew Susan Taylor well enough to take a chance. He parked out front and knocked on the glass door until she appeared from the back office, looking surprised to see him. "John? Everything all right?" "I need a favor," he said, holding out the check. "Can you tell me where this came from?" Susan took the check, eyes widening as she read the amount. She studied the account number, her brow furrowing. "This is from a corporate trust account," she said after a moment. "Confidential. Even I cannot access details beyond the issuing bank branch. Whoever authorized it did not leave a name." "Could it be traced?" "Only if they wanted it traced," Susan replied, meeting his gaze with quiet sympathy. "Whoever sent this went out of their way to stay anonymous." But John nodded slowly, jaw tightening. He thanked Susan and left the bank, the envelope, heavy in his pocket. The drive back to the farm felt longer than it should have, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Back at home, beneath the cold glare of the kitchen light, John placed the envelope back on the table, staring at it as though it might offer answers if he looked hard enough. $50,000. Enough to pay off the bank to save the farm, enough to buy time. But the question remained, what did the giver want in return? The envelope sat on the kitchen table for 3 days, untouched. Each morning, John Miller passed by it, sometimes stopping to stare, sometimes pretending not to see it at all. But the weight of that envelope seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, as though the money inside could somehow fill the room with its silent pressure. $50,000. Enough to pull his family back from the edge of ruin. Enough to clear the debts that had stacked up like a wall between him and any kind of peace. But every time his fingers brushed against the paper, John felt the same gnawing suspicion burrow deeper into his chest. Money like that never came without strings. There was no such thing as a gift that large, not in his world, not among men. Like him who had learned from hard experience that nothing good came easy. The simple thank you written on the note was not enough to make sense of what had been offered. On the fourth morning, unable to hold the questions at bay any longer, John took the envelope back into town. The bank was open early, and Susan Taylor greeted him with a small nod when he walked through the door. She seemed to understand before he even spoke, gesturing him toward the private office in the back where their conversations would not be overheard. "I need to know more," John said quietly as he handed the check across the desk again, "to know where this came from." "I need." Susan leaned back in her chair, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "I told you before, John. It is drawn from a corporate trust account. The issuer chose to keep it confidential. There has to be a way to trace it," John pressed, his voice firmer than before. "Someone on the other end of that line. There has to be." Susan sighed, glancing down at the check one more time. "The account belongs to a larger agricultural investment group. I can see the corporate name in the system, but the individual signer is masked behind the trust. Whoever set this up wanted it that way." John felt his frustration rise, his fists clenching at his sides. He had never been a man to look for trouble where none existed, but this felt wrong. He could not shake the sense that he was being drawn into something larger than he understood. "Can you give me the name of the company?" he asked finally. Susan hesitated, then nodded. She scribbled the name on a scrap of paper and slid it across the desk to him. Carter Agricultural Development. The same name that had been embossed on the business card Daniel Carter had given him days earlier. John stared at the words, his stomach sinking. The connection was too direct to be a coincidence. Daniel Carter, the stranger whose truck he had fixed on the side of the road, the man who had stood at his gate, offering help with that same polite smile. The man who had walked away without ever asking for anything. It had to be him. John thanked Susan, folded the paper into his jacket pocket, and left the bank. Outside, the air was sharp with the bite of coming winter, the sky overhead thick with the promise of snow. He stood for a long moment on the sidewalk, the sound of distant traffic filling the space around him, and let the realization settle. Daniel Carter had sent the money. But why? That afternoon, John drove the back roads that skirted the edge of town, his thoughts tangled in knots as he tried to make sense of it all. He stopped at the feed store, asking the clerk casually if anyone had seen Carter around. The man shook his head but mentioned that a stranger had been spotted at the old ranch property just south of the county line, the one that had been up for sale since the previous spring. Curious, John drove out. That way, the narrow dirt roads winding between fields long since harvested, the land resting beneath a thin layer of frost. The ranch sat back from the road, its fences sagging, the main house dark and shuttered, but the gravel drive showed fresh tire tracks, the soft mud still bearing the imprint of recent visitors. John stepped out of his truck, boots crunching, against the frozen ground, and walked the perimeter of the fence line, peering through the gaps between the slats. There was no sign of Carter, no vehicles in sight, but the evidence was there. Someone had been here, and not long ago. The questions gnawed at him relentlessly. Why would a man like Daniel Carter, with money and power, care about the fate of one struggling farmer in the middle of Kansas? What could he possibly gain from such a gesture? The idea that Carter might be trying to buy his gratitude, or worse, his land, circled in John's mind like a vulture. That night, as the wind howled against the farmhouse windows and the first flakes of snow began to fall, John sat by the fire with the envelope once again in his lap. His hands gripped the edges of the paper, crumpling it slightly, as if the pressure might squeeze the truth from its silent pages. Lena, watching from the doorway, finally broke the silence. "Not been yourself." "Dad, what is going on?" "You have." John looked up, the weight of the secret pressing against his chest. He considered telling her, considered sharing the confusion and anger that had built inside him over the past few days. But the words failed him, trapped beneath the wall of his own uncertainty. "Just tired, honey," he said softly. It has been a long week. But Lena did not look convinced. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the same worry he had seen in Mary's so many times before. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving John alone with the flickering shadows and the questions that refused to let him rest. The doubts had begun to grow, taking root deep in his thoughts, and as much as he tried to ignore them, he knew he would not find peace until he faced them head-on. The first light of dawn crept across the frozen plains, casting pale beams through the windows of the Miller farmhouse. John sat at the kitchen table, bleary-eyed, the envelope now a permanent fixture before him. Sleep had been little more than a passing thought in the last 2 nights. The questions circling his mind refused to loosen their grip, and each hour of silence seemed only to tighten the knots of suspicion in his chest. He had turned the situation over in his head 1,000 times. If Daniel Carter had truly been the one behind the check, if he had sent $50,000 to a man he barely knew, there had to be a reason, something more than gratitude for a roadside repair. People like Carter did not move without purpose. John's instincts, shaped by years of hard living and harder decisions, told him this was no simple thank you. That morning, as the cattle lowed outside and the frost clung stubbornly to the earth, John made his choice. He would not sit idle waiting for the answers to come to him. If Daniel Carter wanted to stay in the shadows, John would shine a light. After a quick breakfast that tasted of sawdust and worry, John bundled into his coat and headed toward town. He stopped at the feed store first, leaning against the counter as he chatted casually with Jim Hardy, the owner, whose weathered face showed the lines of too many hard seasons. "You ever hear of a fella named Daniel Carter?" John asked, keeping his tone light. Jim scratched at his beard, considering. "The name sounds familiar. Somebody mentioned seeing a guy by that name out near the old Whitaker ranch. Said he was asking about land in the area. Why are you asking?" "Just curious," John replied, offering no more. He thanked Jim and moved on, stopping at the diner where the locals gathered most mornings to trade news and rumors over coffee and eggs. The talk was the same as always. Grain prices too low, feed costs too high. But when John steered the conversation toward Carter, heads shook. "Never heard of him," one old farmer muttered between sips of coffee. "Not local, that is for sure," as another added. But when John mentioned the Whitaker ranch, there were nods. "That way last week." The waitress chimed in as she refilled his cup. "Newer truck. Might be your man. Saw some out-of-towner up, looked like money." Driving, John finished his coffee, left a tip on the table, and drove out toward the Yeo. Whitaker Place again. The property had been up for sale for months, the grass tall and uncut around the sagging fences, the main house shuttered. But this time, as he eased his truck down the rutted dirt drive, he saw fresh tracks in the mud again, tire marks overlapping his own from days before. He parked just outside the gate and stepped out, scanning the property. No sign of a vehicle, no movement in the house. But near the barn, footprints in the thin layer of frost betrayed recent activity. John followed them, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Inside the barn, the air smelled of old hay and rusted metal. Shafts of light pierced through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating dust motes that floated in the stillness. In the back corner, near an old workbench, he found fresh cigarette butts ground into the dirt, a sign someone had spent time here not long ago. John's gut told him he was on the right track. He circled the building once more, looking for anything that might give him more. But the place had been cleaned of any clear evidence. Whoever was staying here was careful. On the way back to his truck, he paused at the gate and stared down the long road that led away from the ranch. If Carter was involved in this, why stay hidden? What was he waiting for? John returned to town and stopped at the small county office where land transfers and property deals were recorded. The clerk behind the desk was young, distracted, flipping through a magazine when John approached. "Looking for recent activity on the Whitaker property," John said, keeping his voice steady. The clerk tapped a few keys on the computer and frowned at the screen. Nothing official yet, still listed as for sale, but there was an inquiry flagged last week, a request for detailed property maps. Name on the request. The clerk squinted at the monitor. Daniel Carter. The name landed like a hammer blow, confirming what John had already suspected. He thanked the clerk and stepped back outside, the chill of the wind cutting sharper than before. Driving home, John could not shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something bigger than he had imagined. Carter was not just a businessman passing through. He was circling the land, making moves behind the scenes. The money, the envelope, the check, they were not random acts of kindness. They were part of something deliberate. That evening, after dinner, John sat down at the old desk in the corner of the living room and pulled out the business card Carter had given him. The number was there, printed in clean, embossed text beneath the company name. His hand hovered over the phone for several long minutes before he finally set it down, unresolved. Instead, he took out a notepad and began writing down everything he knew. Carter's name, the check, the ranch inquiries, the conversation at the bank. The facts lined up in neat rows, but the reasons behind them remained a blank space. The doubt that had started as a whisper had now grown into something undeniable. John knew that the only way to find the truth was to push deeper, to follow the trail until Carter had no choice but to show his hand. The fog of confusion was beginning to lift, but what lay beyond it was still unclear. One thing, however, was certain in John's mind. He was not going to let his family's fate rest in the hands of a stranger whose intentions remained hidden. The wind had shifted by the time the following week arrived, bringing with it the sharp bite of early winter and a fresh dusting of snow that blanketed the Kansas plains in soft, white silence. The landscape, so often harsh and unforgiving, looked momentarily gentler under the cover of frost. But there was no gentleness in the thoughts that filled John Miller's mind as he moved through the routines of the day. His hands performed the familiar work, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, but his focus was elsewhere, tethered to the unanswered questions that continued to mount like storm clouds on the horizon. The check remained tucked away in the envelope on his desk, the money untouched, the offer unresolved. But the knowledge that Daniel Carter was more involved than he had first let on sat heavy in John's chest. The inquiries about the Whitaker Ranch, the corporate trust account tied directly to Carter Agricultural Development, the quiet movements of a man who seemed to be playing a game no one else could see, all of it pointed to intentions still hidden from view. It was late in the afternoon, the light beginning to fade when the unexpected knock came at the door. John wiped his hands on a towel and stepped into the front room, his eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar vehicle parked outside. A dark sedan, polished and clean, clearly not from around these parts. Standing at the door was a man in a neatly pressed grey suit, briefcase in hand, his expression calm and businesslike. "Mr. Miller?" the man asked when John opened the door. "That is me," John replied, wary. "My name is Richard Evans. I am an attorney with Carter Agricultural Development. May I come in?" John hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to allow the man into the house. Evans moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to having the upper hand, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor. He accepted the offer of a seat at the kitchen table and placed the briefcase on the floor beside him. "I represent Mr. Daniel Carter," Evans began, his tone measured and professional. "Asked me to deliver a proposal to you." He has John folded his arms, leaning back against the counter. "I figured as much. Go on." Evans opened the briefcase, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table. "Inside you will find a contract for a long-term lease agreement. Mr. Carter is prepared to offer you full operational control of a property recently acquired by his company. The land is located on the south side of the county, approximately 150 acres, fully equipped with modern facilities." John's eyes narrowed as he listened, suspicion deepening. "What is the catch?" "There is no catch, Mr. Miller," Evans replied smoothly. "The contract grants you management rights and a fixed salary, with the opportunity to share in the profits of the harvests. All expenses for equipment and maintenance will be covered by the company. The only condition is that you accept the offer without requesting further details regarding the ownership structure or the purpose behind the investment." John stared at the folder, the weight of the words pressing against him like an invisible, and it was the kind of opportunity that farmers around here dreamed about, the chance to work good land without the crushing burden of debt, the security of knowing the bank could not take it away. But the silence that followed was heavy with the one question that mattered most. "Why me?" John asked finally, his voice low. Evans met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Carter believes in supporting those who demonstrate integrity and hard work. He was impressed by the help you offered when he was stranded. This is simply his way of giving back." John shook his head slowly, the explanation too neat, too convenient. Hand out favors for nothing. "People like him do not," Evans offered a polite smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "The offer stands, Mr. Miller. I encourage you to review the contract and consult with your own counsel if you prefer, but the terms are final. Mr. Carter asks only that you make your decision within the next 10 days. With that, Evans stood, closing the briefcase with a soft click. He reached into his pocket, placing a business card on the table beside the folder. "You can reach me directly at this number if you have any questions." John nodded once, not bothering to offer a handshake, and watched as Evans let himself out of the house. The sedan rolled down the drive and disappeared beyond the bend in the road, leaving only the faint tracks of its tires in the fresh snow. The house was quiet again, but the tension remained, thick in the air. John sat down at the table, staring at the folder as if it might burst into flames under his gaze. He opened it slowly, scanning the neatly typed pages, each clause written in the kind of language designed to look simple while hiding the complexity beneath. The offer was real. The salary was generous, enough to keep his family secure, enough to wipe away the fear of losing everything. The land described in the contract was some of the best in the region, fertile and well-maintained. It was more than he had dared hope for. But the stipulation that he ask no questions, that he accept without understanding the full picture, gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. That night, after the children had gone to bed, John remained at the table, the folder open in front of him, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. He read the contract again and again, searching for the hidden angle, the piece that would reveal the truth beneath the surface. Pride and suspicion wrestled against the desperate need for a way out. The thought of losing the family farm still haunted him, a threat hanging over every breath he took. But trusting a man like Daniel Carter without knowing his endgame felt like a betrayal of everything John stood for. The offer was on the table. The clock was ticking, and John Miller found himself caught between the weight of his principles and the reality of his situation. He knew one thing with certainty: he could not afford to make the wrong choice. The snow continued to fall through the night, blanketing the fields and softening the harsh lines of the Kansas landscape beneath a thick, silent cover. Inside the farmhouse, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dark. John Miller remained seated at the kitchen table, the contract from Carter Agricultural Development still spread out before him. Sleep had not touched him. Instead, his mind had churned endlessly, tangled in the decision that now loomed larger than any debt collector ever could. The words of the contract repeated themselves in his thoughts, each line etched more deeply with every read. The promise of stability, the freedom from foreclosure, the chance to provide for his children without the constant fear of losing the land beneath their feet, all of it dangled before him like bait on a hook. Yet the warning bells continued to ring in the back of his mind. Men like Daniel Carter did not operate without motive, and John knew better than to believe in goodwill without reason. The morning sun rose behind thick clouds, its light weak against the gray of the sky. John moved through the motions of the day, feeding the cattle, breaking ice from the water troughs and checking the fence lines where the weight of the snow had pushed some of the posts askew. Each task felt heavier than usual, his body burdened by the weight of indecision. When Lena and Caleb left for school, John stayed behind, standing at the window and watching their figures fade into the distance. It was while cleaning out one of the drawers of Mary's old writing desk later that afternoon that John's hand brushed against a bundle of papers tucked beneath a stack of receipts and faded envelopes. The sight of his late wife's careful handwriting brought a sudden ache to his chest. The familiar curve of her letters, a bittersweet reminder of her steady presence, the calm that had so often grounded him. Curious, he pulled the bundle free, unfolding the pages with care. Among the papers was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age but still legible. The headline caught his eye immediately. Young entrepreneur leads agricultural innovation effort across Kansas. The photo beneath it showed a much younger Daniel Carter, no more than 28, standing beside a group of farmers at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for what the article described as one of the largest agricultural cooperatives in the state. John read through the article slowly, each sentence adding a new layer to the puzzle that had begun to consume him. The piece spoke of Carter's humble beginnings, the son of a farmhand who had spent his early years in small towns scattered across the Midwest. It detailed his rise from those modest roots to the founder of a multi-million-dollar cooperative focused on integrating technology and sustainable practices into traditional farming. It was the final paragraph that made John's breath catch. The article quoted Carter directly, speaking at the event. "I know what it means to struggle. My family lost everything when I was just a kid. If I can build something that helps even one farmer avoid that same fate, then all of this will be worth it." John sat back in his chair, the clipping trembling slightly in his hands. The pieces began to fit together. The money, the contract, the offer that came without demands for repayment. All of it seemed to stem from something personal, a mission rooted not in business alone, but in a history that mirrored John's own. For the first time, the memory of Carter standing on the side of the road did not seem like coincidence. There had been something in the man's eyes that day, something more than gratitude. There had been recognition. Perhaps Carter had seen in John a reflection of his own father, or of himself. John read the article again, slower this time, absorbing each word. He traced the dates, the locations mentioned, and remembered the stories Mary had told him about the agricultural programs being introduced across the state, initiatives she had followed closely even after her illness had kept her from working. The land alongside him. The realization did not wipe away the doubt completely, but it softened its edge. If Carter's motives were tied to a personal promise, a debt to the past he could never fully repay, then perhaps the offer was not as sinister as it had seemed. Perhaps it was genuine. Still, John's heart remained guarded. He had seen enough broken promises in his life to know that good intentions did not always lead to good outcomes, and yet the thought of walking away from the opportunity now felt less like principled defiance and more like stubborn pride. That evening, as the snow continued to drift down in soft spirals, John called Lena and Caleb into the living room. He held the contract in one hand, the newspaper clipping in the other, and laid both on the coffee table between them. "There. Here's something we need to talk about," he began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was at stake. The children listened in silence as John explained what had happened, the envelope, the money, the offer from Carter. He told them about the investigation, the connection he had found, and the questions that still lingered unanswered. Lena's brow furrowed, her eyes sharp as she absorbed the details. Caleb, quieter as always, sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. "So what happens now?" Lena asked when John finished speaking. "I do not know," John admitted. "This affects all of us, but I wanted you to hear it from me before I make any decision." Caleb looked up, then his voice soft but certain. "Make you weak, it is what you do with it that matters. Mom always said that accepting help does not." John felt the words land like a stone in his chest, the truth of them as clear as the firelight flickering across the walls. Mary had believed in standing strong, but she had also believed in accepting the right kind of help when it came from the right place. The past was connecting itself to the present in ways John had not expected. The stranger on the roadside, the businessman with a hidden history, the echoes of struggle shared across generations, all of it was weaving into the fabric of a choice that could no longer be avoided. The question that remained was whether John Miller was ready to trust the hand that had reached out to him, or whether he would let pride turn away the chance to change everything. 8 days had passed since the visit from the attorney. The contract remained on the living room table, read more times than John Miller could count. With each reading, different things stood out. A legal detail missed before, a clause offering more generosity than expected, the consistent absence of any demanding conditions. But what weighed the most was never the words on the paper. It was the decision itself. John had not slept well, not out of fear, but from the gravity of a choice that was not only professional, but deeply personal, ethical, and intimate. On the 9th morning he signed. He did it quietly, alone, at the same table where he had shared countless meals with his family. The pen glided across the paper without ceremony. There was no immediate relief, no triumphant feeling. Only the sober realization that for the first time in months he had made a choice that could either lead to stability or to another fall. He placed the signed documents into an envelope, drove into town, and hand-delivered them to the address, left by Richard Evans. The receptionist, calm and polite, accepted the envelope with a brief smile and a small nod. "Mr. Carter appreciates your trust, Mr. Miller. He will be in touch soon." The words echoed in John's mind on the drive back home, and they continued to circle in his thoughts in the days that followed. But there was no immediate contact. Instead, near the end of that week, John received a phone call from an unknown number. A young, polite voice invited him to visit the new property that was now under his management. "Everything will be ready to welcome you," the voice said. "Please bring what you need for the day." The location was just over 20 miles from his old farm, in an area John knew only from passing by. The landscape there was greener, the soil richer, and the roads easier to navigate. When he arrived, he found the gate open and a simple wooden sign posted nearby: Sunrise Acres. The main building was modern, but retained the charm of rural tradition: spacious barns, new equipment, shining silos, everything in order, professional, prepared. But what truly caught John off guard was the movement on the property. 3 vehicles were parked near the main house. A white van, unmarked, held video equipment. 2 men and a woman moved between tripods, microphones, and cameras. When they noticed John, one of them walked toward him immediately. "Mr. Miller? That is me. Welcome. We will be starting in a few minutes. Everything is ready." "Inside?" John narrowed his eyes. "Starting what exactly?" "Oh, my apologies. I thought you had already been informed. Mr. Carter is launching a documentary series about real stories of hope and transformation across rural America. The team will record your arrival, a brief conversation, and some images of the property. After that, you will have time to get acquainted with everything here." John stared at the man for several long seconds, processing each word. Part of him wanted to turn around right there. The idea of cameras invading his life did not sit well, but another part of him, perhaps the one beginning to feel the stir of something larger at work, simply nodded. "I want to speak with Carter before anything is filmed." "Of course, he is on his way." Half an hour later, a black sedan appeared at the top of the access road. John recognized it immediately as the same vehicle Carter had used the first time they met. Daniel Carter stepped out with his usual calm demeanor, wearing a dark coat but with a softer expression this time, closer to pride than formality. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand, "it is an honor to see you here." John shook his hand firmly. "I still do not understand exactly what is going on." "I expected that," Carter replied, tilting his head toward the house. "Shall we talk inside?" The house was bright and open, its windows facing the fields outside. A respectful quiet filled the space, broken only by the faint sound of the camera crew setting up in the distance. Sitting at the kitchen table, Carter reached into his coat and placed a small notebook in front of John. "All of this began a long time ago, well before I had the resources to help anyone. When I was a teenager, a farmer took me in when my family had nothing left. He gave us work, food, and guidance, during a time when we were completely lost. I never knew his name, he simply did what he thought was right. Years later, I promised myself that I would pay that kindness forward." John looked at the notebook but did not touch it. "So this is charity?" "No, this is opportunity. Charity ends when the money runs out. Opportunity multiplies. You are not here as a recipient. You are here as a pillar." "What do you mean by that?" Carter leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the table. "This farm is just the beginning. I plan to make it a model, a reference point for other farmers in trouble. But I needed someone real, with history, with integrity. You embody that. And I want to share your story, to inspire others to believe that good people still exist, and that it is possible to rebuild." John remained silent, weighing the words. It was not the kind of thing he had expected to hear. It was not the kind of role he had ever imagined for himself. But there was honesty in Carter's voice. No urgency, no arrogance, only conviction. "Why did you not tell me this from the start?" "Because if I had, you might have turned it down. I needed the choice to be yours, made freely." Outside, the camera crew was testing angles and adjusting equipment. But inside, John felt that the real moment was unfolding here, without an audience. Not because of the project, not because of the money, but because of what this offer meant. For his family, for the land, for others like him. He drew a deep breath, stood from the chair and looked out the window. The earth stretching before him was not the soil he had grown up on, but it was still land, still alive. And now it was his to care for. "We will do this the right way," he said, turning back to Carter. "But no scripts." Carter smiled softly. "That is exactly what I hoped you would say." The sun had not yet fully risen over the Kansas plains when John Miller stepped out onto the wide front porch of the new farmstead. The sky held that soft gray light of early morning, casting long shadows across the fields that now stretched out under his care. The cool air carried the faint scent of wet soil, a promise that the seasons were shifting. The earth was waking, and so was John, not just from sleep but from the long fog of uncertainty that had hovered over his life for far too many months. The work on the farm had begun at full speed. Each day brought with it a rhythm of tasks that demanded attention, but the difference now was the sense of purpose that accompanied every chore. John moved through the fields, inspecting the irrigation systems, talking with the workers, making notes about the maintenance schedule. His hands, rough and steady, worked the soil as they always had. But this time there was something else beneath the surface, a quiet determination not only to succeed, but to honor the unexpected chance he had been given. Daniel Carter's project was no longer just a concept or a contract on paper. It was real, alive, unfolding before John's eyes, as more farmers began to show up at the gates of Sunrise Acres, drawn by the hope of learning, of starting again. Some came alone, others brought their families. All of them carried the same look John knew too well, the weight of hard years, of struggles that had left scars deeper than the eye could see. John welcomed them with the honesty that defined him. There were no speeches, no exaggerated promises, only the truth, plain and direct. He shared his own story, not as a success tale polished for cameras, but as a man who had nearly lost everything and who had learned that sometimes the hardest thing to do was to accept help. The farm became more than a place to work. It became a space of shared learning. Carter's team organized workshops on crop rotation, sustainable farming methods, and financial planning. But what made the difference was not the content of the lessons alone. It was the sense of community that began to take shape among the participants. There, seated under the large oak tree that shaded the main yard, these farmers talked openly about their failures, their fears, and their dreams. One evening, after a long day of meetings and fieldwork, Carter arrived unannounced, carrying a box filled with old notebooks and worn ledgers. He joined John at the small wooden table near the barn, where the two men often met to review the progress of the project. "I thought you might like to see these," Carter said, placing the box on the table. John opened it slowly. Inside were records from Carter's early days, notes from his first attempts at managing land, entries filled with calculations, plans that had worked and others that had failed. Among the pages were letters from his father, handwritten reminders of the man who had taught Carter the value of the land and the importance of resilience. "These were my beginnings," Carter said, his voice soft. "It was not always easy. Most of it was trial and error. But my father always told me that the soil remembers every hand that tends to it." John listened, flipping through the pages, recognizing in those writings the same struggles he had faced. The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of shared experience filling the space between them. It was then that Carter revealed the true extent of his vision. He did not want Sunrise Acres to be a single success story. His plan was to create a network, a system where farmers could support one another, where knowledge would be shared freely, and where no one would have to face the storms of life alone. "I do not want to own the land," Carter explained. "Lead the way. I want to protect it, And I want men like you to. John felt the depth of those words. They were not just part of a business strategy. They were part of a personal mission, born out of Carter's own history of loss and struggle. And in that moment, John realized that the offer he had once suspected of carrying hidden motives was, in fact, an invitation to become part of something that could truly change lives. The documentary team continued their work quietly in the background, capturing the growth of the project but always respecting the authenticity of the process. There were no staged scenes, no forced narratives. The real story was happening in the dirt beneath their feet, and in the honest words shared between those who understood the cost of working the land. In the following months, John found himself stepping into the role Carter had hoped he would embrace, not as a symbol of charity, but as a mentor. He helped guide new farmers through their first seasons, offered advice on managing livestock, and most importantly, listened. He listened to their worries, their doubts, their small victories. He offered them the same steady hand that he himself had once needed. Lena and Caleb continued to be deeply involved, each finding their own place within this new chapter of their family's life. Lena showed an aptitude for managing the complex logistics of the farm, while Caleb spent more time working directly with the animals and in the fields. Watching them grow into their roles, John felt a pride that reached beyond the boundaries of any single harvest. What had begun as a moment of frustration on the side of a lonely road had transformed into something far greater than John could have imagined. The legacy Carter was building was not written in contracts or bank statements. It was written in the renewed hope of every farmer who crossed the threshold of Sunrise Acres, in the laughter of children running through the fields, in the quiet conversations shared under the Kansas stars. And through it all, John remained the same man at heart, grounded, honest, unwilling to sugarcoat the truth, but ready at last to believe that some seeds, when planted in the right soil, could grow into something extraordinary. The air over, the Kansas plains had begun to shift, carrying with it the scents of spring, fresh tilled earth, the faint sweetness of early blooms, and the sharp, clean smell of rain lingering just beyond the horizon. John Miller stood at the edge of one of the main fields of Sunrise Acres, boots firmly planted in the moist soil, eyes tracing the long rows of young crops breaking through the ground. There was a sense of rhythm in the rows, a kind of order that mirrored the new balance taking shape in his life. The season was in full motion now, each day bringing its share of tasks, but for the first time in a long while, those tasks did not feel like battles to survive. Instead, they felt like parts of a whole, steps in a process that made sense. John rose with the sun each morning, his hands steady, his mind clear. The land was not easy, farming never was, but the crushing fear of failure that had once sat like a weight on his chest had been lifted. In its place was the steady hum of work that mattered. Lena had grown into her new role with a sharpness that reminded John of Mary. She had taken to managing the books and overseeing supply chains with the kind of precision that kept the farm running smoothly. She coordinated deliveries, negotiated with buyers, and kept close watch over the budgets. There was a pride in the way she handled the business, a quiet confidence that made John smile each time he saw her talking numbers with the contractors and suppliers who now respected her as much as they did her father. Caleb, on the other hand, had found his place among the animals and the fields. His mornings were spent checking the livestock, ensuring that the cattle were healthy, that the pens were secure, and that the pastures were rotating properly. He had a gentle way with the animals, a patience that seemed to draw them close. In the afternoons, he worked the soil alongside the hired hands, learning the rhythms of planting and harvesting, absorbing the knowledge as though it were stitched into his bones. John watched them both with a mix of gratitude and awe. They were growing into strong, capable people, shaped by the land but not weighed down by its hardships. They carried the legacy of their mother's strength and their father's resilience, and they stood at the beginning of something new, a cycle that would continue long after John's hands had grown too old to hold the reins. The farm had become more than just a business. It was a place of learning, of connection, of hope. Farmers from across the region continued to arrive, seeking advice, training, or simply the chance to speak with someone who understood their struggles. John welcomed them openly, sharing his experiences without pretense, answering their questions with the same honesty that had always guided him. He did not pretend to have all the answers, but he offered what he could: a steady hand, a listening ear, and the lessons carved from his own hard-won survival. The documentary project had begun to reach the final stages of production. The crew remained present, though their filming had become less intrusive, more focused on capturing the natural flow of life at Sunrise Acres. They documented the gatherings beneath the wide oak, the workshops where farmers traded ideas and shared techniques, the simple moments of daily life that spoke louder than any scripted narration. As the footage took shape, the heart of the story became clear. It was not a tale of charity nor one of corporate intervention. It was the story of people who had refused to give up on the land or on each other. And at its center was John, reluctant at first, but now fully present, not as a subject of the film, but as a leader in a movement that was growing larger than any of them had imagined. The conversations that unfolded beneath the shelter of the barn roof often stretched late into the night. Farmers talked about the challenges they faced: drought, market pressures, the fight to maintain family lands in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to small agriculture. But there was laughter too, shared meals, stories of unexpected successes and plans for future seasons. There was a sense of unity, of belonging, that reached deeper than the shared profession. They were, as one young farmer put it during one of the evening gatherings, a family forged by the fields. It was during one of these evenings, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, that Carter stood quietly at the back of the group, listening. He did not speak often during these meetings. Instead, he observed, taking in the transformation of his idea into something real, tangible and living. When John caught his eye across the firelight, there was a silent understanding between them, a recognition of what had been built and of what was still possible. Carter approached John after the group had begun to disperse for the night, the stars emerging one by one above the quiet fields. "I had hoped for this," Carter said softly, "more than I imagined. But seeing it here, seeing what it has become, it is—" John nodded, his gaze turned toward the dark outline of the distant hills. "It was a good idea, but it would not have worked if it had not been real. People can tell when something is honest." Carter smiled faintly. "That is why I needed you." John shrugged, his hands in the pockets of his work jacket. "It is not about me, it is about all of us, about giving people the chance to stand on their own feet again." The words hung between them, simple but true. The project was not about one man or one farm. It was about creating a space where those who had been forgotten or dismissed could find their footing again, could remember that the land was not just a burden but a promise. As the first planting season under John's leadership drew to a close, the fields stood ready, rows neat and green against the horizon. The equipment was clean, the livestock healthy, the hands steady and prepared for the work ahead. There was no guarantee that every crop would succeed, no promise that storms would not come. But the foundation was solid, the plan in place, the people committed. In the calm of that evening, as John stood alone watching the stars blink awake above the Kansas earth, he felt a peace he had not known for many years. The fight was not over. It never truly would be. But he was no longer fighting alone. The new cycle had begun, not just for the land, but for everyone who had chosen to believe that together they could grow something stronger than hardship. The years moved forward with the steady patience of the Kansas winds, carrying with them the cycles of planting and harvest, of growth and rest, of struggle and renewal. The farm, now known throughout the region as Sunrise Acres, had become more than a symbol. It was a living, breathing testament to what could happen when resilience met opportunity, when pride gave way to partnership, and when hard work found the soil it deserved. John Miller sat on the wide porch of the main house, the wood beneath, him worn smooth by time and use. His hands, though still strong, showed the lines of age more clearly now. They were hands marked by a lifetime of labor, of holding on to hope even when hope seemed too heavy to bear. The horizon before him stretched, wide, the fields vibrant with the green of another promising season. Overhead, the sky glowed with the golden light of early evening. soft clouds drifting lazily as if they too had come to rest for a moment. At his feet, Caleb was repairing a small section of a broken harness, his fingers nimble and sure. Nearby, Lena stood speaking with two younger farmers who had arrived just that afternoon, eager to learn, full of questions and ideas. The air around the farm carried the buzz of conversation, the low hum of machines in the distance, and the occasional laughter of children playing between the barns. The land was alive, not only with crops, but with people, with stories, with shared purpose. John watched as one of the new arrivals pointed toward the fields, asking Lena something about crop rotation. She nodded, explaining patiently, her gestures confident, her voice clear. It struck John how naturally leadership had settled on her shoulders, how much she had grown into the role she once hesitated to take. Caleb, too, had become a pillar of the operation, known among the livestock handlers for his calm and capable manner. They were no longer children struggling to understand the weight of their family's burden. They were partners in this legacy, contributors to something larger than themselves. The documentary that had begun as a simple record of their journey had long since been completed. It had traveled far beyond Kansas, shown in schools, farming conferences, and community centers across the country. But more importantly, the message it carried had taken root in the hearts of those who had watched it. Calls continued to come in, letters arrived from distant places, each one telling a similar story. A farmer on the edge, a family unsure if they could hold on, a plea for guidance, for connection, for a path forward. John answered as many of these messages as he could, though the project had grown so large that Carter's organization had now established a dedicated team to manage the network of support that had blossomed from the first seed planted here. But John's words, simple and honest, continued to be the heartbeat of the mission. When asked what had saved him, he never spoke of the money, never focused on the legal contract that had secured his place. Instead, he spoke of the decision made on a cold morning beside a broken-down truck, the choice to help without expectation, and the unexpected return of that kindness when he himself stood at the edge. Sitting on the porch, John leaned back. In his chair, the creak of the wood familiar and comforting. His gaze traveled across the farm, watching as the young farmers worked alongside his own children as they discussed techniques and shared laughter. The sight stirred something deep in his chest, a warmth that rose like the sunrise itself. One of the younger farmers, a boy barely out of his teens, approached the porch hesitantly. He stopped at the steps, his hat in hand, eyes bright with curiosity and respect. "Mr. Miller," the boy began, his voice steady but humble, "happened here, about how this all started. Can I ask you something?" "I have heard a lot about what." John gave a small nod, motioning for the boy to continue. "What was it, sir? What was the moment that changed everything for you?" The question hung in the air between them, as soft and weighty as the breeze that stirred the leaves in the nearby trees. John let the silence linger, thinking back. Through the years, through the struggles and the choices, through the long nights and the breaking days. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees, his eyes meeting the boy's with the calm and strength of a man who had lived every inch of the story he was about to tell. "It was just a broken-down truck," John said, his voice quiet but certain, "and help. And the choice to stop." The boy listened intently, waiting for more. "But what really changed everything," John continued, "was understanding that sometimes the smallest actions can grow into something bigger than you ever imagined. A seed planted in the right soil, even if it is just a moment of kindness, can take root and change the course of a life." The boy nodded, holding the words close, then thanked John softly and returned to the group by the fields. John leaned back once more, his eyes lifting toward the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light against the fading blue. As the evening settled around him, John felt no need to say more. The land spoke its own truth, the rows of growing crops, the steady work of hands, young and old, the laughter and the hope that drifted on the air like seeds carried by the wind. This was the legacy he had helped to shape, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, honest choice to care. The 13 parts of the story were now complete, But the life of the farm, of the people who tended it, of the seeds planted both in soil and in hearts, would continue to grow, season after season, cycle after cycle.